welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Alyse Russel, and I'll be hosting today for our webinar. The webinar today is using cover crops for soil health and weed suppression in cotton. I'm your host, Alyse Russel. I'm the Senior Manager of Global Sustainability Programs for VF Corporation. I'm here today because VF Corporation is a parent brand of 11 companies, including companies like the North Face, Timberland, and Vans. And we are actively working on a lot of different regenerative commodities to use within our products. The VF Foundation is a founding member and supporter of the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund and provided a grant to the Soil Health Institute to advance the adoption of soil health management systems across more than 1 million acres of U.S. cotton cropland. And so if you're not familiar with the Soil Health Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soils through scientific research and advancement. And so today, I am very excited to moderate the webinar discussing 2 fact sheets developed by the Soil Health Institute. And this will be with Texas A&M AgriLife Research and the Rodale Institute. And these fact sheets explain how cover crops can help cotton farmers control weeds, work in organic systems, compare different crop species across the U.S. cotton belt, and feature insights from farmers who have successfully used these methods. The webinar is an outcome of the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund, led by the Soil Health Institute, with the mission of empowering cotton growers and their trusted advisors with the tools, information, and networks they need to successfully adopt regenerative soil health systems. In today's webinar, we are fortunate to hear from Soil Health Institute's Soil Health Educator, Jessica Kelton, and Texas A&M University Agriculture Conservationist, Dr. Jodie McVane. So lastly, a few things about today's event. The presentation is being recorded, so it can be shared with each and every one of you after the webinar. As well, we'll send out the accompanying fact sheets. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And you can also upvote questions that you would like to prioritize. And Jessica and Jodie will address these live at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, if you would prefer to have captions on for the webinar, you can enable those by clicking on the 3 dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions. So with that, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I will hand things over to Jessica Kelton to start digging into today's content.
Thank you, Alyse, and thank you for agreeing to moderate today. And as you said, my name is Jessica Kelton. I'm a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute, working on our U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund project. Before I dig in, I really want to say thank you to the groups from Texas A&M and Rodale Institute for collaborating on this work. It was a lot of work and a lot of effort that went into it. So we appreciate our funders, but we also appreciate the work that Texas A&M and Rodale Institute did to develop these fact sheets to provide a resource to growers for considering cover crops for weed suppression. So just a kind of big picture, we developed 2 fact sheets, really wanting to pull all of the information that's out there about cover crops for use for weed suppression, specific to cotton production. So we have 2 fact sheets, one that's really focused on that cover crop management decisions and think considerations before you even plant. And then the second one kind of summarizes the research that's been done throughout the cotton belt, looking at specific species and weed suppression potential of those species. So those are your two fact sheets. I know that the fact sheets will be mailed, or links to the fact sheets will be mailed out to the webinar participants, but they are on our website. So I encourage everyone on here to go take a look, kind of dive deeper. We're going to go through the high points in the webinar, but there's a lot more information that should serve as a really good resource tool if you dive down into those fact sheets. So just to kind of get started, we know there are a lot of benefits from using cover crops. From the soil health side, improving erosion control, increasing soil organic carbon, increase nutrient cycling, improve water infiltration. But these resources that we put together are really focused on that other benefit of cover crops as being able to reduce the weed pressure in cotton systems. So I think it's really important to note here for growers that each cover crop really does have a specific management requirements. They all have unique benefits depending on the species that you choose to go with, and they can have some limitations that need to be considered prior to planning. So we developed these fact sheets to help cover some of that information on management and termination strategies, as well as the benefits and limitations of specific species that was noted in the research that we were able to identify. So thinking about those management considerations, I think it's really important to say this and stress that proper planning is really essential. Just like you put in a lot of planning and a lot of effort before you plant your cash crop, it's really important to have proper planning for successful cover crop establishment and the ability to control weeds with those cover crops. So growers need to decide early on what species that you're going to go with to ensure that you can have access to that seed. Sometimes seed availability can be low, so deciding early, but you also need to consider what's your ideal planting date. Keep in mind that an earlier planting date is going to provide greater biomass and ensure that you get a stand established for cover crops that are sensitive to frost. So considering when you're going to plant, and then also considering seeding rate and seeding method. What's my rate? How much seed do I need? How am I going to seed it? Am I going to no-till drill it? Am I going to broadcast it? Those things need to be considered prior to even buying your seed. So keep all of those in mind. But then also it's really important to think about the field history for each field that you're planting a cover crop. What have I planted in the past? There could definitely be some impacts and cover crop damage from any kind of residual or carryover herbicide. So keeping in mind what is the field history for each field that I'm going to plant a cover crop. Other management considerations to think about are termination type and termination timing. So termination methods can vary, but in non-organic systems, primarily we see that chemical termination is the most common due to being relatively inexpensive and pretty effective. And sometimes the chemicals can be used with or without some kind of equipment. So types of equipment that can be utilized in addition to or instead of chemical termination would be roller crimping that can help prevent cover crop regrowth or seed production, and using tools like high residue cultivators, in-row mowers, weed zappers, among other equipment that's available can be used to manage breakthrough weeds in those organic systems. So in systems where chemical termination might not be an option, there are some equipments that can help with managing the termination of that cover crop. But it's also really important to consider the termination timing. And now there can be some trade-offs with determining when I'm going to terminate a cover crop. So the longer you wait to terminate, the higher the biomass levels that you can produce. But that can also be can deplete the soil of soil moisture. So really dependent upon your geographic region and some of the rainfall totals that you get and when you're going to plant, those things need to be taken in consideration when you're thinking about termination timing. So termination timing and method really need to be those management considerations that you think about before purchasing and planting a cover crop. And then also choice of cover crop species and seeding rate. I think it's important to note here before I move into some of the high points of the second fact sheet is that seeding rates, cover crop species, and cover crop species performance for weed suppression can be highly variable from region to region. So it's important to look at the information that's out there, but also see how relevant it is to your region because there can be variability from region to region. So choosing your cover crop based on what's going to work for your geographic location, but also what's best suited for your rotation. What are you planting year to year? What cover crop species are going to work best in that rotation are things to consider. But you also need to consider, the water needs for a cover crop and the nutrient needs of the cover crop, but also what following cash crop am I going to plant and what are those needs. Those things need to be considered when thinking about your cover crop species. And then again, thinking about what equipment you're going to use to plant and terminate. Do I need other equipment to be able to think about using a cover crop on my farm? So that's kind of the high points of that first fact sheet, just those management considerations that you need to think about. How am I going to manage what cover crop species I'm going to use, and the ins and outs of producing this as a crop, because again, we have to put in some planning and management for a cover crop, for that cover crop to be effective, for weed suppression or for any other benefits from a cover crop. So those are the high points from the first fact sheet. And I kind of want to jump into the second fact sheet, where it's really kind of digging into the research that's been done. And so in the fact sheet and here in the webinar, there's a map kind of showing you the location of the research that's been done. In 2023, Texas A&M, the group from Texas A&M really did a deep dive into the Web of Science and Google Scholar, just looking at all of the published research focused on cover crops, weed suppression, and in cotton systems. And they were able to identify 14 unique research trials done across the cotton belt, and looking specifically at the cover crop weed suppression potential specific to cotton systems. So this map's here, but it's also in the fact sheet. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of variability from region to region. So as you read through that fact sheet, make sure you can reference back. There is a table that lists all of these research trials. Reference back to those locations to see how relevant that data is for you and your operation. So this is just kind of that summary of those locations. And then that second fact sheet really just focuses on those specific cover crops that were included in that research, the cover crop weed suppression potential of those cover crop species, and how those cover crops were managed. So just going to try to highlight some of the cover crops that were researched and that are presented in the fact sheet. And this is kind of the setup for the next few slides, but it's also the setup in our fact sheet, where we provide this table that lists the cover crop species, some of the benefits, but then also potential limitations that need to be considered if you're going to choose that cover crop to use on your operation. So we'll start with cool season grasses. I'm going to start with rye, because rye is one of those most commonly used and researched cover crops in the U.S. And there's a reason for this. It is well suited for many environments. It has a really good weed suppression potential because of that biomass that's produced. And there's some amount of allelopathy, where there's some allelochemicals that help to suppress weeds in the system. So in the research that we identified, it was noted that rye was able to reduce weed numbers and size in cotton systems early season, as well as provide some suppression later in season compared to a fallow field. But I really want to highlight this and make sure that you're very aware of it, because of that high level of residue that's we're able to achieve with a rye cover crop. It's really important for growers to think about this, particularly if they've never planted a cover crop before. Because of that residue, you need to make sure that you have the proper equipment for termination and for planting into that. I think that's one thing that you can hear growers that have never planted a cover crop before really struggle with. If they get a high residue cover crop system out there for year one and they're not equipped to terminate or plant into it, it can be challenging. But because of the advancements in our equipment and the availability of equipment, we've really come a long way where growers can plant into those high residue systems and get that good seed to soil contact to ensure that you have a successful stand of your cash crop following a rye or any cool season grass that has high residue. But it's really important to note on the front end, using these cover crops, it's we get a lot of residue and we can suppress a lot of weeds, but make sure that we're prepared to deal with the amount of residue that's in that in the field after that cover crop. So some other cool season grasses, wheat and triticale. While wheat can prevent early season weed emergence, it does grow shorter and produces less biomass than cereal rye. So it can be a good option where a grower may want less residue, or it's ideal for growers that are just starting out with a cover crop and are really concerned about having to manage that high level of biomass. And wheat has been shown in the research that's included in those fact sheets to be able to reduce weed emergence in cotton for up to 8 weeks after planting. And then triticale, which is a cross between wheat and rye, can provide a high biomass like cereal rye, but with shorter growth, similar to wheat. So those are two options for cool season grasses and to include as a cover crop for weed suppression. And then oat. And oat and black oat are also small grain species that can produce plenty of biomass for weed suppression. And they're very much suited for warmer climates. Oat is adaptable to a hot, dry weather and has been shown to control weed populations in cotton as effectively as a high input in herbicide system if it's used in conjunction with a pre-emergent herbicide. So oat with a pre-emerge herbicide can have just as much weed control as one of those herbicide management systems that's really high input. And if you're in one of these hot climates where water is rainfall is a limitation, oat may be a good option that can still produce the biomass to really help with weed suppression. And then switching gears a little bit, looking at some of the broadleaf cover crop options, legumes, which include clovers, winter pea, and vetches. They're really known for their ability to provide nitrogen to the following cash crop. But something to note here is that sometimes these seed can be expensive to plant as just a single species cover crop. And so often what you see on farm and in some of the research is that this included in a cover crop mix with a grain to reduce those upfront seed costs, but also to ensure that you have greater weed suppression. Legumes can establish quickly early and to suppress winter weeds, but they produce a lot less biomass than a grain crop does, and they'll also decompose more quickly. So that's what you will see in some of the research that's highlighted is that legumes are evaluated alone as a single species, but they're also evaluated in a cover crop mix because including that grain ensures some weed suppression a little bit further into the season because those legumes really just break down really rapidly and can't provide a longer weed suppression through that critical weed-free period for the cotton. Another broadleaf option are brassicas, and you think of those and it's turnip and mustard. They're commonly used because they can be allelopathic, which can help reduce some weed emergence. But then also some brassicas, which known as tillage radish or some other version of the tillage radish, they are known to have that really deep, thick taproot that can help alleviate a compaction layer. And so just like with legumes, sometimes it may be expensive, but they can have variability in the percent of weed suppression. And I think that's highlighted in that second fact sheet, that there is some variability when used alone. And so again, another option for using as a cover crop in a cover crop mix. And so since we talked about the cool season grasses and the cool season brassicas and legumes and those broadleafs really used as in a cover crop mix for weed suppression, I just want to talk about this, and I think we mentioned it in the fact sheet a little bit. We have a lot of research that shows that doing a cover crop mix is very beneficial, particularly to provide some plant diversity. It's important to keep in mind that just because I'm planting a mix and that I've got maybe a grass and a legume and a brassica, it doesn't mean that I'm going to have optimal benefits from each species that I'm putting in there. If I'm planning to get nitrogen off of a legume crop, but I'm putting it in with a grain crop, I might not get as much nitrogen as I would if I were planting just the legume crop itself. So it would be great if we got optimal benefits from each of those cover crops, but that might not always be the case. So it's really important to think about, what am I putting into my mix? How am I going to plant? Am I putting in a small seed with a larger seed? Am I using a planting method that's going to be optimal for germination for all of those species? Are the species going to be compatible with each other when I'm putting them out in a mix? And we have that research to support the use of cover crop mixes. It's because there are many different seeding rates and many different mixes that we could do, it's really difficult for us to evaluate that in research. And so what you see, there's not a lot of research to be able to evaluate all of the options you have for cover crop mixes and what's going to work, compare, one mix to the next. So what you hear on farm and anecdotally is that a lot of farmers are really doing a lot of trial and error, trying to figure out what cover crops are going to work to give them the best weed suppression, but it's going to work for their rotation and their location, and within the constraints of their equipment and their costs that they're able to pay for those cover crops. So that is one reason why in these fact sheets, one thing we wanted to highlight, I think it's wonderful to have a kind of a one-stop shop looking at the research that's been done and that's available, looking specifically at weed suppression potential of cover crops. But it's really important, I think, as a grower to get to hear some of the perspectives of growers who have done these practices on their farm and some of the tips and the tricks that they mention. So we did highlight some of the experiences of growers in cotton across the cotton belt within these fact sheets. So I do encourage you, when you're reading through these fact sheets, to take to pay special attention to those bulleted points and those highlight boxes that really kind of bring out the perspective and the experience of growers using these cover crops within cotton systems. So we thought that was really important to include in this as well, not just the research that's been done. So those are quick points. Hopefully I didn't move through this too quickly. I do want to have time for Q&A. I think Dr. McVane has some really great perspectives, so I'll leave some time for that. But just to summarize, cover crops are not widely used in the U.S. in cotton, but we do have a lot of research and on-farm experience that show that they can be beneficial for both soil health and weed suppression. But again, it's really important as a grower to look at a cover crop just like you would your cash crop, and that you have to manage it and you have to plan for planting that cover crop and to manage it throughout its growing season. So thinking about your species selection, your planting date, your termination date, method, the equipment, the species, all of those things need to be carefully considered before you start planting your cover crops. To be used for weed suppression or for any other benefit of a cover crop. And I think it's really important to say this here too, is we pull all the information into these fact sheets, but they do cover a large region. So consulting local resources is going to be key to making sure that you're successful with using these cover crops. So I encourage you to reach out to experienced farmers, to people with technical expertise that can kind of guide you on how to choose and how to manage those cover crops. And with the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund, we do have a team of 23 technical specialists and farmer mentors spread across the cotton producing states that we cover with the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund that can provide that support and kind of guide cotton farmers who are interested in implementing soil health management systems on their farm, or even if you just want to discuss what works and maybe what wouldn't work. So we encourage you, if you have questions and you want to reach out, feel free to reach out to me and we can put you in touch with our technical specialists or some farmer mentors to get some perspective from on-farm experience with cover crops for weed suppression. But before I end, I do want to thank our funders and our collaborators. We were able to do this work because of the Hearst Foundations and the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol and those additional supporters of the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund, and then our partners on this collaboration with the Rodale Institute and Texas A&M. So thank you to them, and we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentation. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Texas A&M University Agriculture Conservationist, Dr. Jodie McVane, to join us for the Q&A session along with Jessica. And so I'm going to read a couple of the questions that you all submitted in the Q&A box. So also please take this time to continue to add questions, as well as upvote the ones that you're interested in hearing about. But let me dive in to some of those. So one of our first questions is, Jodie, can you comment on if a mix of crops would help with fall establishment in dryland areas?
Yeah, so many of the regions that cotton is grown is moisture. A lot of times the farmers don't have a lot of moisture, and it depends if a lot of these southern regions, if you have a hot and dry summer, your soil moisture, may be low when you want to plant your cover crop. But if I were you, I'd make sure timing is important for you to plant these cover crops. So number one is plant as early as you can after you harvest your cotton. All right. The second one is make sure you have your seed ready and everything. And if you know a rain is coming, see if you can time that and plant your cover crops before that rain. Now, if you're talking about what species, your small grains, are pretty reliable. But if you want to do a mix, I would do a small grain and a legume, and maybe two small grains or two legumes. But if you're talking about which ones would establish better in dryland areas, I guess my answer is I would go with what your needs are instead of trying to decide on the moisture, because if your need is erosion control, you'd want to go with grasses. If it's having some nitrogen for your next crop, you would do grasses and legumes. So think about why you're planting the cover crop, and I think that will benefit you instead of trying to figure out which one because it's dry and so forth. Jessica, do you have any comments on that?
I think just for me, and I know you're in Texas where there really is water limited factors to consider, those that are already using cover crops, particularly if you can find a grower that has a mix, they may have already done a lot of trial and error to know, okay, if I'm doing a mix, this one really does not work well when there's really dry conditions. Just trying to find someone who has had experience with it to maybe you can skip trying a species that doesn't do well when it's really dry. I don't know if I'm not guessing that's kind of the gist of it. If I have a mix, maybe I'll have one species that does work if we have really dry conditions. But if it's super dry, it's gonna be challenging regardless of what species you go with. So like Jodie said, if you're ready to go when you do get a rainfall, that's probably gonna be the most important factor rather than if I have multiple species out there trying to find one that's going to work in those dry conditions. Just be ready to go when you get the rainfall.
And there are a lot of resources, and we want to encourage you. There are a lot of resources in your state, in your region. There's NRCS soil health specialists. There's people at your in your county, at your land conservation departments, at your extension service. So all of you should have resources in your county. And one of the best things is if you can find other people who are doing cover crops and start a small cover crop group where you can communicate, I think that will really help your success.
And you mentioned a couple, but what are the major factors when deciding between legumes or non-legumes as cover crops?
Yeah, so legumes are, I think of it, like I said, I always think, what is my next crop? What do I want to get out of this cover crop? So that is really important. Those are the questions you need to ask for your farm because every farmer has different situations. So, the legumes are going to be more expensive than the small grains, but I like mixing them together. My research was on mixes. And I like mixing them together because you can get weed suppression from the small grains. And plus you can get some legumes also that will help your next crop. So I like mixing legumes and small grains together. But, there are websites where you can do like a budget of how much would it cost for your mix. So you can look at that. But number one is, why are you planting the cover crop? What is your greatest need on your farm? And then that will help you decide.
Okay, another question we have is, have any simulation studies been done to estimate yield loss from cover crop water use, specifically for dryland cotton, and optimal termination dates?
Yes, so there has been studies in Texas about water use in cover crops, and some of the findings include the cover crops are going to use water. Okay, we know that. But if you make sure you're terminating at least 2 to 4 weeks before your next cash crop. And the hope is that you can get a rain after termination, because the cover crops are going to put roots into the ground, make some pores available for when it does rain, that the rain will get in the ground, so that you'll be able to conserve that moisture with the residue that the cover crop is providing. So the residue is going to provide moisture retention. The roots are going to provide greater infiltration. So the goal is terminate the cover crop, you get a rain, and then you plant your crop. I mean, that's the best scenario. But if you're not sure about the rain, which many reasons of cotton growing you're not, then I guess make sure you're terminating that cover crop 2 to 4 weeks. But that research did show that if you get a rain after terminating cover crops, it did not have a negative effect on the next crop. And that was in Vernon, Texas, with Dr. Paul Delon. That was his research. He has a paper out on that. And I think there's a few more papers. I don't know the name of them right now, but that has been shown in research.
And Jodie, I'll step in, and I'm not sure of who did the research, but it was in Texas, looking at soil moisture following a cover crop. And while that cover crop may be utilizing some of the soil moisture, after termination and after a rainfall event, what they noticed was that the soil moisture replenishment rate was faster in a cover crop system than it was without one. So while yes, you do have some soil moisture that's being used, the ability to retain it and quicker and hold on to the moisture once you get it is higher in a cover crop system.
Yes, and I think that was Dr. Paul Delon's research.
In addition, are there any studies that have been done on the impact in organic matter content when using cover crops?
There's a lot of research on soil organic carbon and the benefits of cover crops with that, but the impact in organic matter content. Okay, so I think I understand the question. So remember, when you use cover crops, my suggestions to farmers is start small and get good at it. And you are so creative. All of you farmers out there in the audience, you are so creative. You can get good at it. And then the next thing is be consistent. If you can find something that works, adjusting your equipment and so forth, continued use is going to give you the benefits of greater soil organic carbon, which relates to soil organic matter. Okay, so consistent use. And also remember, the Soil Health Institute and myself as a conservationist also recommends management system. Think about it as a management system. So reduce tillage, using cover crops, always have something green and growing if you can, leaving as much residue on the soil surface. That is how you're going to build organic matter. It's going to be hard in southern climates if you're just using the cover crop and then you're tilling it right away, or just continue with tilling excessively. You probably will not be able to build a lot of organic matter, but you would if you're consistent and reducing tillage and always have something green and growing, and think of those systems, soil health management system. Jessica, did you have anything to add on that?
I think I would say that if you're looking at research, looking at how cover crops can help build soil organic matter, make sure that you're looking, because it's going to depend on your soil type and your climate too, on your ability to build that organic matter. So make sure you're looking at papers that are relevant to our resources that are relevant to the area you're in, because you can have some. I'm in South Alabama, where we have really sandy soils and soil organic matter is relatively low. So even a small percent increase is a really good increase for where we are. So if you're reading and looking at the resources that are out there and the research that's out there, make sure it's relevant to where you are.
Yeah, and speaking about regionality, we have another question about that. So Why do cover crop benefits manifest more quickly in some regions compared to others? And is there a way that these benefits could be sped up?
That's a good question. And yes, it does matter what region. And Jessica just mentioned it. How much rainfall do you get? What is your soil type? Your soils with more clay compared to really sandy soils, you're going to be able to build that organic matter easier. All right. And if you're getting adequate rain, that is really going to help you by building the biomass and getting some moisture in the ground before your next crop. So it totally depends on what region you are, but whatever region you are in, please remember there's other great benefits to cover crops. Erosion control is a big factor. If you're losing topsoil, you're losing, where your organic matter would start building. And, where the soil microbes, need a habitat. So there's all the other benefits of cover crops. But it does depend on temperature, and in colder regions, you're going to be able to, you do not have speedier mineralization and decomposition. So it depends on climate, it depends on soils, it depends on, how much biomass you can build. So yes, it is by region.
Yeah, and Jodie, I'll just mention too, another thing is, what is your weed pressure? That can really vary and kind of have variability in how effective your cover crops can be for suppressing weeds. But I think Jodie already mentioned one way to kind of speed it up. It'd be wonderful if we could just speed it up and get those benefits, year one. But she mentioned using a cover crop with or without tillage. Without doing the tillage operations, you're really going to start seeing those benefits faster than if you were doing a cover crop but doing tillage after, before and after your cover crop. So using a cover crop with reduced or no till is probably going to help. It was one of the better ways of trying to speed up those benefits from a cover crop.
And consistency, making sure you're consistent.
Okay, what are the biggest barriers keeping farmers from using cover crops, especially in cotton production?
We've been asking that question for quite a while, and we have actually sociologists working on that. And the farmers know these reasons, but some of them may be, risk aversion. As a farmer, it's risk aversion, maybe probably one of the greatest ones. The other one is, change of equipment. They may have to buy different equipment and get used to something different, and equipment, costs money. So it could be equipment use. Some of it really could also be social. There's areas across our country where not many people use cover crops, and agriculture is a culture. So it could be a social issue, financial issues. So it's a combination of all these different things, and it's not just one. It really is a combination, and each person has to make their own decision because it's their farm. But encouragement, and that's why we're doing these webinars and getting these fact sheets out. We know that it can be done, and we want to encourage farmers to try it and get the help that they need and experiment, because they're the ones who can get good at it. So I encourage you, go forth.
Yeah, and Jodie, I'll agree. I know it's really difficult to change practices or consider about bringing in another management. And it is, you have to manage a cover crop. So it's timing and having the time to do that when you get to harvest. And then you're thinking about, well, we're essentially planting another crop we're not going to harvest. But I think, and I'm not telling any grower something that they don't already know, but with market prices where they are, it can be a challenge to justify an additional expense when cotton prices are low, to add in those additional expenses. But I think if you have an opportunity to talk to growers who have done it and done it successfully, they say, yes, it's an expense, but it's an investment that we will get that a return from that expense in within, a year or two, we'll see a return from the expense we spent on those cover crops. But yeah, I think if you ask 100 growers, you're going to get 100 different reasons on why they haven't adopted.
And the other thing is too is, it's a big decision, but I've known farmers who have tried cover crops, and in 2 years they said they would never go back to not using them. So many of the farmers that I've worked with have actually just convinced themselves that this is what I need to do for my farm, and stewardship and all the benefits. So
Great. Is it safe to say that the most challenging regions would be dryland cropping systems when beginning a cover crop program?
well, I don't know if it's dry land, but if dry land, yes, but how much rain do you get in dry land? Dry land is kind of like a vague term where, yeah, if you have irrigation, it's going to be easier going. But if you're living in, West Texas or the panhandle of Texas or the western parts of the Great Plains in those states, the western parts of those states, yes, it is going to be more challenging. There's no doubt about it.
And then in terms of the effectiveness on weed suppression, is there a study or an opinion on which one would be better, like a wider leaved crop or a crop with allelochemicals? I'm saying that wrong.
No, you got it right.
Okay.
Yeah, allelopathic chemicals. Yep, you got it. You did well. Yes, it is known that your grasses, your cereal rye, your oats, your triticales, wheat would be at the lower, that they're going to give better weed suppression. And the thing about it is, there's a couple things with that. First of all, you really need to have, it's not going to be your all answer. So what I'm saying is this: you need to have a program for weed suppression. Like if you have a field, make sure that's full of weeds. You have to chemically kill and get that prepared for the cover crop. You don't just plant the cover crop where there's already excessive weeds. So thinking through that. But yes, small grains are excellent. But then on the other end, you have to remember that some of that small grains has high lignin material. The bacteria, the soil microbes are going to be looking for nitrogen in the soil to be able to break down those residues. So you may have to do supplemental nitrogen for your next crop. So you need to think of all, there's details. There's details you need to think about, but overall, the small grains are excellent for being able to get biomass in a short period of time, and then the residue stays around longer. But I also like mixing the small grains with the legume because I get a little mix of both. It kind of helps the grass grow. It helps, it helps the next crop, but hopefully that helped.
Yeah, so I think you're very much right on the using the small grains, because it's about biomass production and ground cover. So you're trying to shade out after your cover crop is terminated. The more ground cover you have, the more shading of the ground to suppress weed germination. So and I think that's probably the difference for when you're looking at a cover crop, is how much residue and how long is that residue going to last. That's, those are the comparisons for, what's going to be the best for weed suppression. And most of the time that's going to be a small grain crop.
Yeah, and actually I always encourage anyone also, you're going to get to recognize your cover crops when they're growing, but also go and look and get to know your cover crop when it's dead too. Okay? So know your cover crop when it's growing, but also know what it looks like and how it's sticking around, after it's terminated. So don't just forget about it after it's terminated, because you can learn a lot just by your own observations. And, for that year, take notes. Is this sticking around? Well, is it sticking around like for 6 weeks or so forth? But so look at both of those scenarios when you're out in the field with your crops, not just when it's growing.
And I'll piggyback on what you just said, Jodie. Not only just knowing your cover crop, but also know your weed pressure. What weed species are you dealing with the most? And knowing a little bit about the germination time frame for those weeds are going to really help you decide what's going to be best for you to use as a cover crop for weed suppression.
That's right, because a lot of the weeds in the southern regions where cotton is grown, they're still growing in the fall. They can produce seed in the fall. That's why, fall weed suppression with cover crops is really a benefit.
Great. Okay, so what is the first measurable soil indicator to show improvement when cover crops are implemented? And how early does this change contribute to the overall benefits of cover cropping?
Well, that is a good question. There's several different soil health indicators. One of the ones that come to my mind just right now is called wet aggregate stability, where you're seeing if those cover crops are building aggregates to help resist erosion. Building the aggregates also helps with water infiltration. It's a pretty simple, inexpensive test that you can get done. So that's one that comes to my mind. There's several others. There's soil organic carbon, but that, like I said, that's a long-term type of test. So if you're looking for something that will give like a quicker indication, they also have an active carbon test. That's another soil health indicator that's used. There's several others. There's a carbon dioxide respiration test that people are doing now. So that is another one. But remember, if you're going to do these tests, make sure you're comparing somewhere where you have bare soil and you're not doing any cover crops compared to where you are. So don't just do it, where you're doing the cover crops. You want to kind of have a comparison for yourself. Do your own little trial on your farm. Okay, I'm going to do cover crops in this field and not in this field. Maybe do the carbon dioxide respiration test, the carbon mineralization test, the active carbon, and the wet aggregate stability, so you can compare those two scenarios for yourself. And how long would it take to build aggregates? One of my studies, I did 2 years of cover crops, and I had the greater amount of wet aggregate stability percent where I did the cover crops compared to where I just had a bare soil control. So I did 2 years of cover crops.
And Jodie, I'll just throw this in there for anyone who's interested. If you're looking at those indicators that change over time with using a cover crop, there is an app. It's called the Slakes app. It's a free app to use. So if you want to be able to track that, a field where you've got a cover crop and a field where you don't, you can use the Slakes app to do it for free and kind of measure and compare as you transition to cover crops in your operation. So I encourage you to look at that as a way to see how long it's taking for that aggregate stability to change in your fields.
And you can do that right on your phone.
Great. Well, awesome. It looks like we covered most of the questions for today. There were a lot of them, so thank you all for contributing those.